so much, Amrita and Sukhi, for inviting me to Khaki and the wonderful work that you're doing. The next time I'm in Mumbai, I'll be sure to participate in some of it. And what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to take you through part of the Red Fort. And I hope whatever I share will lead to some questions in your minds, and then we can have a dialogue following that. So I'm going to begin my talk today about the Qila-E-Mubarak, the Red Fort of Shahjahanabad, with an image which most of us, including children across the country who have just entered formal school, will recognize. This image is part of Delhi ka Lal Qila, the Red Fort, and this photograph of its red walls is not just deeply symbolic of Delhi, but also of the subcontinent of India. The Lal Qila is a national icon. It's a symbol of the struggle for freedom against British rule. A name and an image used to advertise all sorts of products, from basmati rice to restaurants in London to matchbox labels, as well as to endorse different ideologies, political persuasions, and philosophical beliefs. However, what exists inside these impressive walls is barely 1/10 of what there was when the Lal Qila was built during the reign of the 5th Mughal emperor, Shah Jahan. Visitors to the fort are oblivious of this fact. So was I when I visited the fort for the very first time. But even though I did not know then how little of the original Red Fort remained, I sensed that something did not make sense. As a trained architect, I found it hard to understand basic questions about where did the emperor, or for that matter, anybody living in the fort, eat or sleep or bathe. This intrigued me so much that I started ferreting around for answers, and it set me off on a research quest, which went on for decades, sifting through and analyzing the fragments of records available, of which the handful of Mughal buildings in the fort are the most vital. After all of that, I was able to get a little more sense of the original form and functioning of this unique fort, some of which I shared in a book that first came out 20 years ago and whose second edition has just been published. The book is fairly long, about 400 pages in the second edition, and detailed, but there are still many aspects of the fort that I feel I have not been able to do justice to. So what I'm going to try to explain today is quite a tall order. I'm going to describe something that you and I actually see very little of on the ground, and in the brief time that we have of about 40 minutes or so. Naturally, there will be much that I'll be obliged to leave out of this talk, but I hope I will be able to convey what to me are the most important aspects. To do this, let me go back to the image that we're all very familiar with. We see this often, and we routinely salute it, especially each Independence Day, with the flag of India fluttering aloft the Red Fort's Lahori Gate. But what if I said that this is actually the antithesis of the fort's original design? Yes, it is. The ramparts from where the Prime Minister of India addresses the nation were not part of the Red Fort when it was built in the 17th century. What difference does this fact make, you might ask? Well, it means that the street that we now call the Chandni Chowk, which was the main street of Shahjahanabad, the city that Shah Jahan established, was not blocked by these ramparts. Instead, it led straight through a bridge into the main gate of the fort, the Lahori Gate, which in turn led in a direct access to the emperor on his throne of justice, where he sat every day in the Diwan-e-Aam, the hall of public audience. This means that visually, spatially, and functionally, there was no barrier between Shah Jahan and his people in the city. This changed when the ramparts and an additional smaller gateway that we see today were made on the orders of Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan, who was then imprisoned at the Agra fort, is reported to have written, "Dear son, you have made the fort a bride," and put a veil upon her face. This act of making the ramparts across the direct entrance to the main gate meant that access to the fort and the emperor was metaphorically and actually made longer and more indirect. And this distance and difficulty was converted into something far more opaque and ominous when the fort fell into the hands of the British after 1857. The spaces inside these ramparts, around these ramparts, and within the fort were irreversibly altered by the British after 1857. They removed battlements, planned the demolition of everything within 500 meters around the Red Fort, and destroyed almost all the fort's original buildings, as you can see in this map. In their place, they constructed tall, grim barracks. The structures that were spared were attacked, pillaged, remodeled, and abused. Practically all its art and artifacts were looted, scattered, or lost. Some conservation work was carried out by the Archaeological Survey at the beginning of the 20th century to undo part of this damage, as well as to present the fort as a showpiece to and a backdrop for visiting British aristocracy and royalty, such as King George and Queen Mary's state visit for the 1911 Darbar. A party was held for them at the gardens of the Red Fort, after which they put on their robes and crowns, and, as Queen Mary records in her diary, stood on the balcony where the Mughal emperors formally showed themselves. But though some parts of the fort were restored, this was done in haste, and this conservation impetus soon petered out. Today, 370 years after it was established as the crowning jewel of Shahjahanabad, on the banks of the river Yamuna, only a few pavilions and walls are left in the Red Fort. As you may see in this aerial photograph, where I have outlined the existing Mughal structures. So the reason we see and understand so little of how the Red Fort was used is because so little of it remains today. This is also the reason that earlier Mughal forts, such as those in Agra and Lahore, which have far more of their original structures remaining, seem much grander and more like what we imagine an imperial fort to be. So the question is, why did the British specifically demolish and make over so much of the Red Fort? The reason for this lies in the Red Fort's reputation, the fame of its design and riches, the symbolic stature of its occupants, and the way in which it was used, described, and represented. And all these facets of the fort are linked. So let me explain how. The Qila-E-Mubarak or the Qila-E-Mubarak, the blessed and exalted fortress, some of the many names by which the Red Fort was famous, was designed as the grand finale of imperial Mughal forts, just as the Taj Mahal was the grand finale of imperial Mughal tomb gardens. The Taj and the fort were created at the peak of Shah Jahan's superlative patronage, recognized both in his time and after. The fort's foundations were marked out on the 29th of April, 1639 CE, and its design was reportedly led by the master architect Ustad Hamid and his brother Ustad Ahmad, who is also believed to have been associated with the building of the Taj Mahal. Records show that in its original form, the pavilions, gardens, and palaces of the Red Fort were crafted with Fatehpur Sikri sandstone, the finest Makrana marble, Aleppo glass, and a range of semi-precious stones, gold, and silver from all over the trade centers of the Mughal Empire. They were built in perfect proportion and detail with the same quality of refinement as the Taj Mahal still shows. Shah Jahan moved between his forts in different cities, but the Red Fort came to be his favorite abode. Though his successor Aurangzeb did not live in the fort after the initial years of his reign, and neither did Aurangzeb's son, practically all the Mughal rulers after them chose to stay in the Red Fort. Thus, as a seat of the empire and as a Mughal ruler's favored residence, the Red Fort enjoyed a huge reputation. It not only set the trend for architecture all over the Indian subcontinent, but also attracted invaders during its long and checkered history. These attacks culminated in the British assault of 1857, which was different from all the previous attacks because the British did not just loot and leave, they looted and stayed on. After exiling the last Mughal ruler Bahadur Shah Zafar from Delhi and hanging or shooting most of his descendants, the British erased all traces of the earlier way of life by large-scale demolition of the architecture of Shahjahanabad and of its fort. The pioneering British historian explorer James Ferguson called it a fearful piece of vandalism to the most magnificent palace in the East, perhaps in the world. After this vandalism, the British stamped their presence in this famed palace of the Mughals through their own version of architecture. To better convey the extent to how they transformed the fort, I'm showing two maps of the fort from just before and after the demolition. So this one that you see dates from the 1840s. And in this, I've darkened the open spaces. And you can see, therefore, whatever is black are the open spaces. And now this is after 1857, after the demolition. And you can see the change in the inside of the fort. And it's been converted into practically an empty shell. Let's also refer to some drawings a little before the British appropriation of the fort. And some of these were commissioned by Sir Thomas Metcalfe. He was a chief representative of the British Governor General at the Mughal court in Delhi from 1835 to 1853 CE. And these drawings therefore date from the time when the later rulers, whose power and resources we know were greatly reduced, lived in the fort with their families and entourages. The interior of the Red Fort is very different from what we see today. It is complete, populated, and pulsating with life and activity, even if it is run down in parts. And if we consider some other British accounts from this time, spanning two ends of the social spectrum, as it were, the diary of Sir Metcalfe's daughter, Lady Emily Bailey, in 1848, and the memoirs of the marauding soldiers who roamed the fort soon after the takeover of Delhi in 1857, we find that they describe the vast size of this castellated palace, how they wandered through its courts, of how it was quite a form in itself, and of its sublimely beautiful buildings intermixed with gardens. So evidently, before the destruction and conversion that followed 1857, the Red Fort still retained much of its fame as well as the power of its design. What was this design, and how did it manage to survive even the change in fortunes of its later inhabitants, whom we are told were such reduced versions of the earlier great Mughals? So this design was made up of many different kinds of interlinked buildings, spaces, and functions, almost like a city, in the same format as earlier forts established by the Mughals. And this is a conjectural restoration of the fort, conjectural drawing showing what the fort might have looked like. And this was made by Gordon Sanderson, who was, he was part of the Archaeological Survey of India, and he took part in the very first conservation attempts at the fort, where some excavations were also done. And based on those excavations and drawings and earlier records that they had, this is a conjectural view of what the fort might have looked like before so much of it was demolished by the British. And we can see that there are many, many kinds of spaces in the fort and lots of different areas, which is, as I said, in the same format as earlier forts established by the Mughals, which were like mini cities almost in the range of their activities. But the Red Fort was also different from these earlier forts. While these earlier forts were amalgamations of various styles and modes of construction built over the reigns of different rulers, the Red Fort was the only urban Mughal palace complex to be built at one go, at the same time as its supporting city. So its design could thus improve upon all the other issues faced in the older forts, such as overcrowding or danger of erosion to the riverbank, or problems in movement within and around the imperial forts. By an intelligent site location and by creating separate areas connected by a formal sequence of grand streets, walled gardens, and open courtyards, the fort succeeded in creating an atmosphere reflective of a powerful emperor, while also retaining many areas away from the public gaze, with sufficient privacy for multiple functions. And this is a map of the fort from the 1840s. It's part of a larger map. And again, the areas that are outlined in black are the ones that exist today. The rest of it doesn't. But you can get a sense of the different kinds of areas within it. What you see in red are the walls, which also accommodated arcades and colonnades. And you can see that they divide space, and some of that open space is in the form of gardens, which are colored green. So there are different areas within the fort, which are all within their sub-areas, as it were. So therefore, the residential and other buildings of the emperor were away from the public gaze, with sufficient privacy for multiple functions. And all the other buildings, of course, also were within their own walled areas. And the buildings that the emperor lived in were a series of different pavilions for different functions, linked by screened courtyards and gardens. What this meant was that the private areas were not visible from the ceremonial parts of the fort. And also because of the fact that it had so many forecourts and gardens, when some of these open spaces were taken over for less impressive buildings during the reigns of the later Mughals, it did not affect the general impression of vastness and grandeur of the fort. And this is a drawing, it's like a panorama, which dates from the late 18th century. And even when the individual buildings in the fort were looted later on by the Persians, the Afghans, and the Marathas in the 18th and the 19th centuries, the overall procession of one forecourt after another, leading up to the different palace pavilions, still added up to a grand effect, as you can see. The design of the fort also accommodated multiple kinds of users and uses, even when Shah Jahan was ruling. So it was not only a residence of the emperor and the ladies of his household, but it also efficiently housed soldiers, maids, craftspeople, and other service sectors who worked within the fort, while being a showpiece of the Mughal Empire, a recreational space, an administrative center, and so on. And the intricate configurations of its pavilions, courts of justice, imperial gardens, halls of audience, kitchens, tables, etc., made it something that in contemporary parlance we would Consider, like a combination of Rashtrapati Bhavan, North and South Block, Parliament House, Supreme Court, Secretariat, Cantonment, Crafts Museum, etc. And all these functions were planned such that each was part of a formal larger plan, as you can see, but yet retained its individuality. So what can we learn from the design of the Red Fort? The planning and detailing of the Red Fort, which made it not just an epitome of urban architectural patronage in Shah Jahan's time, but also one of the finest examples of planning, building, and living, have important lessons for us, both as designers and as clients. Firstly, the design of the fort demonstrates how many activities can be accommodated within a relatively limited area without intruding upon each other. Despite being the residence and the prized patronage of the richest ruler in the medieval world, the fort did not just function as a residence of a monarch. It was socially inclusive, and it created opportunities for economic and cultural interaction. Visitors, great and small, from within the city and beyond the boundaries of the empire, noblemen, kings, petitioners, soldiers, ambassadors, craftsmen, weavers, even the poorest of the poor residents, all came regularly to the fort or worked within it. Secondly, the fort's design shows how we can be ecologically considerate. The different spaces and buildings within it were planned so that there was no unnecessary wastage of resources. Instead of the high maintenance lawns that pass for gardens today, the vast gardens in and around the fort were essentially orchards. They worked as productive areas, as well as places of pleasure, entertainment, and repose. They moderated the microclimate, and they used only the optimum amount of precious water. Similarly, water in the fountains that cooled and decorated the fort's pavilions and gardens and bathing chambers was recycled for irrigation or for watering animals. The palaces of the emperor and his family were single-storied pavilions. They were not conventional, huge, towering vertical complexes. And their imperial status was signaled by the quality of their proportions, their materials, and their detailing, as well as a series of grand entrance sequences that led up to them. Different pavilions were connected to each other through colonnades, through verandas, and through courtyards. And all this gave flexibility in them being used at different times for interchangeable functions. All its forecourts and gateways were also multifunctional. They could be used for people to gather, for administrative work, for court ceremonial, as well as circulation spaces. Thirdly, the fort's design as a development of the traditional indigenous courtyard typology seamlessly integrated built and open areas. And again, in this, the open areas have been colored black, so you can see the proportion of open areas within the fort. So what happens is that utilization of space can be maximized in this way while keeping construction to the minimum amount. So the areas in white are the areas which are actually the built structures, and all the other stuff that you see, which is black, are the open areas. But as you can see, the open areas are enclosed and they are given a certain scale as well as a certain context for each area of the fort. And basically, the open spaces, as you can see, are far greater than the number of built structures. So the built structures and the open spaces were located and configured based on an interlinked and sophisticated system of geometry, as well as a system of use, of course. And awnings, qanats, and water channels in the verandas or the walls, walled arcades, the pavilions, shaded and enclosed the open space so that it could be used comfortably in all seasons. And finally, the fort demonstrates how high art and design may be used for spatial and functional benefits. Each of its components, whether the form or detail of its gardens or its pavilions, or its forecourts or its colonnades, was useful and beautiful. This is an image of the Diwan-e-Am, the Hall of Public Audience. And as you can see, the form, structure, and decoration in the pavilion cannot be separated from each other. So the arches which hold up the pavilion are also beautiful to see, and they enclose space as well as transmit a sense of space. The decoration is not superfluous, it's part of the very structure. And this leads us to the question of how the fort should be conserved today. Indeed, since the British broke up so much of the Red Fort, and if practically nothing of it exists on ground, should it be conserved at all? The answer to the question of why it should be conserved lies in the fact that we can all learn so much from even the little that remains of the fort, as I did, for instance. And as to how it should be conserved, the official custodians of the fort, the Archaeological Survey of India, do of course follow a program of conservation. But this is, in effect, it continues the British template. So as we saw, the British not only removed or misused the fort's original Mughal structures, they also isolated and separated the fort from its city. And even when they conserved and restored part of the fort, they concentrated on just some of the few remaining Mughal buildings. Their prime objectives in doing so were to use these few parts of the fort as exotic backdrops to stage ceremonial shows or political events. There was no serious or sustained attempt to convey the original qualities or functions of the fort, or to restore the form of its open spaces, whether the gardens, which they interpreted as swathes of lawns instead of reinstating them as orchards, or the formal geometrical forecourts and streets, which they kept undefined and amorphous. And this is precisely the same approach today. The fort is separated from the area around, even from its contemporary city of Shahjahanabad, by fences, water-guzzling lawns, roads, dreary municipal parks, gates, and officialdom. Many of the few remaining Mughal buildings in it are in a state of neglect and decay. Some parts of the fort continue to be used for state spectacles, but there's no attempt to communicate either the volume or plantation or scale of the original architecture, or to bring back their function as social spaces open to the people of Shahjahanabad and Delhi. While many different layers of history have left their mark on the fort, and this is a plan of the fort in which I've superimposed different layers, as it were. And this, of course, makes it of great historical interest. But the reason for the fort to be designated a World Heritage Site stems from its unique original design. And it's clear that any conservation attempt should aim to communicate this design. Here, it's important to state that the design of the Red Fort depended as much on the treatment and form of its open spaces and landscaping as on its buildings. Thus, the interpretation and presentation of these spaces and their components, whether they were courtyards or colonnades or gardens or water channels, is as important as that of the buildings they enclosed. Let us also remind ourselves that the Red Fort has lived through an equivalent of around 15 to 20 human generations, that only about 10% of its unique original form and detail exists, and that records of this form are few and far between. So how is it possible to communicate its original design and its cultural, architectural, and artistic value? We can look at the example of another city, destroyed, resettled, and remade time and again, to which Delhi has often been compared as the Rome of Asia. Of course, one could equally call Rome the Delhi of Europe. Many historical parts of Rome do not exist anymore, yet one can still comprehend what their scale was and experience some part of their original form, even when there is no building left above ground, through glimpses of their foundations and a sense of their overall extent. There are other ways too of conveying how the original appearance of the fort may have been, through adequate and authentic 3D and 2D information, explaining the unique design and life cycle of the fort, through reinstating its cultural, architectural, and artistic attributes, through restoring the same qualities of inclusiveness, of concern for the environment, and for material and human resources that Shah Jahan and his builders had, and through promoting the very crafts and construction skills that made the creation of the fort possible. So that the Red Fort remains the Qila-E-Mubarak and truly continues to be blessed and a blessing for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anisha. How beautifully and gradually you introduced us to the history of Lal Qila. I must admit that I visited it so many times as a child and even as an adult, and never envisioned what could have been because it's not there. But the fact that there was so much in the city and not just Diwan-e-Aam and Diwan-e-Khas, I think it's a beautiful representation that you've done today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And it's so, like you said, it was the pinnacle of fort making, and just like Taj Mahal was a pinnacle of tomb gardens. So that's an interesting perspective. Again, something that I did not associate with the Lal Qila at all. So there are a few questions. Let me put them out to you. The first question, of course, is from Pavitra, who wants to know, where was the Taksal in the fort?
Where was the Taksal? She's talking about the stables, she?
Taksal means a factories. The
Karkhanas? Are you talking about the Karkhanas?
I don't know what is Taksal then. I thought it was the... Pavitra,
Well,
would you tell us what you're asking?
Well, let me explain how the fort worked. For those of you who've been to the fort, we enter the fort through its two main public gateways, and the Lahori gate is the one that everybody is familiar with, which is the one that faces what we call Chandni Chowk today. And the public, what I call the public common domain, was towards the Lahori gate and towards the Delhi gate, which was the other main public gateway. And that housed the Karkhanas, it housed the areas where the soldiers stayed, where the Mughal military stayed, where the stables were, the elephant stables, as well as a horse stable. So basically, if we are trying to orient ourselves, this is the western and the southern part of the fort, which is closer to the city. And what is interesting is that though this contained, let's say the service sector of the fort in a way, this also was the ceremonial way to enter the fort from the city. But you didn't get a sense of any kind of, let's say, less formality in this. And this is because each of these areas were within their own walled and arcaded divisions, which defined your area of movement and also separated different areas. So it was, I mean, it's fascinating that you're entering through the main ceremonial gateway of the fort, and right to your left and right you have the production centers, as well as the areas where the people who worked in the fort lived. So it's not as if they've been pushed to a corner. They're right there, and they have their own area which has its own privacy, and which gives, which allows them to conduct their lives as well as their work without any issues of being overlooked. And at the same time, there's this proximity as well as privacy. So I hope that answered your question, Pavitra.
Dr. Katare says that it is the mint. So would you have an idea of where the mint?
No, I don't quite know where the mint is, because none of the plans of the fort actually talk about the mint, or none of the maps or the descriptions talk about the mint. The other thing that also happens is that the Red Fort is inhabited, I'm talking about Shah Jahan's reign now. It's inhabited in the 3rd decade of his reign. And while he moves into the Red Fort, there are certain functions that remain in the Agra fort for some time. So, for instance, the treasury for a while remained in the Agra fort because the kind of governance that the Mughals followed was that the emperor took a personal and active interest in everything, whether it is administration or if it was conquest, etc., and moved very frequently between the uh, different imperial cities, as it were. So there were certain functions that continued in the older cities because though Shahjahanabad is a contemporary city of the Red Fort, all parts of it were not completely functioning at the same time as when the fort was inaugurated. So there's a to and fro that happens. But there is no specific mention in any of the court histories that I've come across or in the maps of where the mint could have been.
Okay. Pavitra says that the Shahjahanabad mint was the active mint till 1818, till the British closed it.
Right. So does Pavitra have any idea where it was?
Pavitra, please drop in a message in the chat box if you have any information and share it with us. We'll continue with the rest of the questions till then. A.K. Dharyal says that it's eye-opening to see how much was demolished by the British. And of course, it'll be great if it could be restored to its original glory with the help of the relevant departments. I'm sure that that's both tough and an expensive proposition and requires much more than just money to make it go through. But I'm sure all of us hope that something like that can be done. But it would be a big challenge, right? I mean, also because you would have very little information of what
Yes.
was before.
Yeah, so actually, an actual reconstruction is not possible because, as I mentioned, we have very, very fragmented sources on the fort in terms of how the three-dimensional appearance was. As far as the drawings, etc., are concerned, for instance, from Shah Jahan times, they're basically miniatures which are of specific parts only. They're like, zoomed in details. The later drawings, which are panoramas, are more like broad sweeps. So we don't have specific records, and that would be conjectural. But as I mentioned, it's possible to get a sense of the kinds of spaces. So, for instance, there are certain buildings that remain, the Nakkar Khana, which is a drum house, the Diwan-e-Aam, which is the hall of public audience. What doesn't remain is the surrounding colonnades, which gave scale as well as enclosure to these buildings and also defined the space as well as a sense of movement. But for instance, if it was possible to get the limits of the courtyard back, and the courtyard is, of course, interrupted by the British barracks today. But I think that also makes a very effective point. So, for instance, just as a thought, if we could have a glimpse of the foundations, if they could be revealed, and then they're interrupted by the barracks because that's a historical fact. We can't, and I think we shouldn't do away with this part of history. It's the reason why the fort appears the way it does today. So then both things happen. You get a sense of what the original space was like. You also get a sense of its interruption, and therefore you can appreciate better what remains and what doesn't remain. So that's one way. And then of course there are ways of, we have ways of communicating that through drawings, through information on site. But the idea is to communicate. I think that's important. And the ways then will emerge.
Like you said, pretty much like what Rome has or Turkey has, with layers of past exposed, so people can see what was there in the
Yes,
past.
you can get a sense of what it is because today one doesn't know, one doesn't appreciate the fact there's so little of the original Mughal structure standing.
Jyoti has a question. She says she always wondered how the later British architects and writers wrote about the grandeur of India and the fort. So, how did that attitude change and cause so much, and how did they cause so much destruction and plunder?
Well, you see, the thing is that initially when the British come in, they actually they almost present themselves as as kind of vassals of the Mughals, even though they are controlling. So when after the Battle of Delhi, when the British effectively kind of start controlling the city, even then they come, they present nazars to the emperor, they come for audience, and they become part of the court ritual because it's still exotic, still unfamiliar. But with time, it's like familiarity breeds contempt, and there is this sense that they don't need the rulers, the Mughal rulers anymore to give them any kind of credence or credibility, and they actually want to replace them. So even before 1857, there's talk of asking the Mughal rulers to move out of the Red Fort and go to Mehrauli, and they're already trying to move in. And in fact, there is a British commandant of the guards who starts staying above the Lahori gate and, in a sense, controlling the movement in. So basically, it became more blatant later on, the idea of control. And then after 1857, it was an act of, it was like a political act of political reprisal, where it was a statement that was being made, and no quarter given, really.
Of course, Pavitra goes on to say that it was a palace in Shah Jahan's time, and the shift of capital from Fatehpur Sikri changed it to an army fort by Aurangzeb. So hence the Lahore.
No. Fatehpur Sikri is much earlier. Fatehpur Sikri is during Akbar's time. So Fatehpur Sikri was abandoned pretty much. In fact, even in Akbar's time. So the capital was then both Agra and Lahore were where Jahangir and Shah Jahan also spent a lot of their time. And finally, when it moved to the Red Fort, it was not just a palace, as I explained. It was like a mini city, and that's a normal sort of conventional conception of a palace, that it's of a fort, that it's essentially the residence of a monarch. But this was much more, which was like in the tradition of the imperial Mughal forts. But as I mentioned here, there was an opportunity to actually, in a sense, build afresh, though there were some structures that remained from earlier times. And what's very interesting is that Shah Jahan doesn't get his builders to demolish the earlier buildings, like the Salimgarh fort, for instance, which is made by Salim Shah, which is established by Salim Shah Sur about 100 years before the fort, or there are baulis inside the fort, which date from earlier, and they're integrated into the design of the fort. But essentially, Shahjahanabad and the Red Fort are new construction ventures, which improve upon the earlier, experiments that both Shah Jahan and Jahangir and Akbar had tried out. And it functions. The other point that I want to make is that it functioned very well in the way that it was designed till 1857, till it was forcibly, demolished. So large parts of the city were also demolished at the same time as the fort.
So there are two more questions about forts, and I'm going to put them both together to you. Jyoti wants to know about the idea of forts. That were the forts in India conceived by Chhatrapati Shivaji, or was it the Mughals, and so on. So she wants to know which dynasty or culture started the forts. And the other question is from Kajal, who also wants to know how the Indian forts are different from the Western forts, and in particular the Red Fort. So if you could go at the front.
Yeah, so the thing is that, you see, fortresses as a typology have been there for, as long as the need for fortification, for defense, as well as for offense was felt. And you have, even within the area of Delhi, Lal Kot is supposed to have been one of the earliest forts, which is basically the Rajputs, the Chauhans. And so on. All over India, you have very, very many kinds of forts. And of course, they change depending on the context, right? So, for instance, if you look at the forts in Rajasthan, or even the forts in Maharashtra, which are very often atop, craggy mountains, they have a different kind of approach. They have a different kind of defense system. The thing to understand is that the Red Fort is an urban fort complex, right? And the other interesting thing about the Red Fort, both with reference to the Mughal forts that it was a continuation of, and the other forts in the subcontinent, also, which, there's several things that were common, because let's remember that climatically and culturally, there are continuations. So the Red Fort is an urban complex, and it is built at a time when the empire is fairly stable, and there's no real perceived threat, which is why, as I mentioned, the two main gateways into the fort, they didn't have this, the time-honored staggered entry to the gateways of a fortress, because there wasn't any need felt for that level of security. Now, that doesn't mean that the Red Fort was completely open to attack, because this was done in a different way. The security was dealt with in a different way, which was by creating different sub areas in the fort, which had their own forecourts, which had regulated points of entry. You couldn't just, so today you can scramble in to the fort in all parts of the fort. But earlier on, you would have to go through guarded gateways, through a sequence of forecourts, through a sequence of gateways to enter the more private and the let's where the emperor stayed, etc. So the way of dealing with security was different, but in any case, the major intention or objective of the fort was to work in consonance with the city. So the fortifications were, it were not, they were, well, in a sense, they were secondary, I'd say. And Salimgarh was like a fort within a fort, in a sense, because it was a citadel, it was an island fort. And we find that it's used for the more, let's say, the more secret functions, the more defensive functions. Aurangzeb, for instance, imprisons, when he has to imprison Murad Bakhsh first, and then later on also Suleiman Shikoh and Sipehir Shikoh. He imprisons them there first before sending them to the Gwalior fort. Later on in 1857, it's from Salimgarh that, the guns in the fort mount an attack on the British on the ridge. So it used various kinds of ways. It's not a conventional fort in that sense at all. And therefore, what's again interesting is that it continues the cultural, let's say, response in terms of materials or building techniques, but it adapts them to the specific requirements of the time and place where Shah Jahan was ruling.
So there are a few more comments and exchanges about how old the forts are. And okay, that leaves us with Kajal's question about the difference between the Indian forts and the Western ones.
Yeah. So now the thing is that, again, you see, as I said, the Red Fort is very complex, and there's only that much that I can communicate here. The book, of course, has many more drawings which help to visualize it. But for instance, James Ferguson, who, when he came upon the remains of the fort shortly after 1857, he himself talks about the fact that this fort is like a mini city, which, as I said, was the tradition of Indian forts. And he compares it to the Escorial in Madrid, which is the closest that that a Renaissance European palace comes to the functions of the multiple functions of a city, which is what the Red Fort, the Agra Fort, and the forts before that are part of. And but that's like a fraction of the area, as well as the kinds of functions that the fort encompasses. And this is linked to the way of ruling, the way of rulership that was there within the Mughal frame of reference. So, for instance, the emperor is presented, number one, as a father, right? So he's supposed to be both benevolent, but he's, of course, at a distance. So there's this idea of the emperor being accessible while retaining a certain distance. Then the fact is that the emperor is deeply involved as the head of state and as a very, very active patron in everything, in both the economy and the culture of the cities. So therefore, as I said, there are karkhanas inside the fort. There are performances even during the later Mughals. There are musical performances. So it's like a center of patronage. For the Red Fort itself, Shah Jahan was very deeply involved even in the process of design. So he himself he came to the site, he saw models before that. So it's to do with the idea of kingship, as well as what the fort actually means in the economic and cultural life of the city. So it's far more complex, and it's not just a residence. And I think another important difference is the way buildings are made, which is linked to the cultural and climatic context that we stay in, which is something we forget today completely. And when we make our new buildings, unfortunately, we look at at a model that's not of our time. So for instance, I spoke about this, the courtyard typology and the pavilion typology. So pavilions, courtyards, verandas are all a part of the indigenous way of building. And the Red Fort kind of refines it to a point where the proportions, etc., are really highly evolved. But the basic kind of, let's say, the way built and open space react or respond or integrate with each other is very different from what we see in Western palaces. Many Western palaces, where the idea is of a building which kind of sits in a landscape. It's like an object, and here the building is a part of the landscape. It's like a conversation that happens, and it's not as if pavilions are not used in other parts of the world, but again, the scale of the pavilion is very different, right? So the size of the pavilion, the size of the courtyard, all that is very different. And that makes, therefore, the difference in both how the buildings function as well as how they appear, and what is the kind of building that you're making. So, for instance, later on, when the Viceregal Lodge is made, both the people who are making it, who are commenting on it, they compare it to the earlier Mughal and the Indian palaces, and they say that they are little places, like nursery closets and small spaces, because they don't understand this relationship of built and open area, and the fact that you can make do with smaller spaces because you're using open areas so extensively. And there is a way to use the open area. So if you noticed in the plans that I showed of before and after the British moved in, you can see how the open space have changed completely. They've changed dramatically. They're like these amorphous, undefined places. And that, I think, is the intrinsic difference, both in terms of the forts and the palaces, as well as in the notion of architecture in general, which is what, the forts and palaces are reflective of. So I hope that clarifies the question that
about the forts. Yes, thank you. Okay, so of course there are recommendations on what can be done, like you mentioned, like making a model or whatever, which people can sort of at least see and appreciate what the past was like. Jyoti again says that okay, if Red Fort is urban empire, then maybe it can be compared to
it's a
the
focus of an
Shahjahan.
urban empire. It's not the urban empire, it's the focus of the urban empire. And it's like a microcosm. In a sense.
So she
Yeah.
says maybe it can be compared to the Shaniwar Vara in Pune. I'm not sure whether you have compared the two, but that's her sort of comparison. Shikha Jain says that fortification is, of course, started from the Harappan times, and there were many other variations. And of course, Rajput, Mughal, and Marathas came much later. Pavitra makes a comment that the gunpowder and cannon development had special impact on the design of fortification. So hilltop forts. What
Sorry,
is
I
it?
didn't. I lost you there.
Trying not to
There's
not
some
that.
background
People
noise.
mute themselves. Yeah. So Pavitra says that the development of gunpowder and cannons had a special impact on the design of forts, and the hilltop forts were given up in favor of the ground-based, more protected forts.
Well, that's kind of a generalization. It's only true in parts. Yeah.
She also wants to know what would have been the total number of people who were residing in the Red Fort by 1857.
Well, there are some accounts which, I mean, I don't know how to this, because they're just accounts that have come to us. But for instance, there are accounts of Shah Alam's family, which is supposed to number 500 in Shah Alam, is a good many years before 1857. So there were thousands of people within the fort. And again, you see, the thing to realize is that in the 1850s, what happens is that after the Brits start moving into the fort and city, they not only take over a lot of the administrative and the fiscal functions, they take over a lot of the spaces within the city which were traditionally part of the emperor's routine and his family's routine areas. So, for instance, during Shah Jahan's reign, you had Dara Shikoh's Haveli. So Dara Shikoh had his own Haveli. He was the eldest son, and he stays on the riverfront. So the riverfront was a very coveted kind of place. But later, the crown princes, all the crown princes and the other offspring of the emperors stay within the fort. They have their own families. Then you have the wives and the daughters, and then you have the support sector. You have the entire Mughal military. You have the attendants of the fort. So, for instance, the seraglio where the Mughal wives and their attendants stayed. It's a huge part of the fort, and then you have soldiers. So there's a huge number of people, and but they are, in a sense, they're constrained to stay in the fort later on, because the traditional gardens, for instance, you had the Shalimar Bagh, which was ahead of the Lahori Gate area. You, of course, had Mehrauli, which continued to be an area where the Mughal emperor would go for, and in the monsoons, he would go for a long spell for about a month and a half. They went for regular visits to the dargahs, etc. So there were these forays that they made, but essentially they were all constrained to stay in the fort. So it's supposed to number in many thousands, and all of them were turned out after 1857. Of course, most of the sons and most of the contenders to the throne, as well as most able-bodied men of Shahjahanabad, were killed after 1857, which is again, and the entire population of Shahjahanabad, which remained, was turned out of the city completely in the winters. So there was, it was a huge number of people who were actually, yes, they were dislocated, and they were also killed after that. But as I said, what also happens is that the other thing is that with the Red Fort, the records, again, because of its reputation, and there was this kind of vicious reprisal that it suffered. So, for instance, the British didn't knock down so much in the Agra fort or the Lahori fort, or the fort in Lahore. And later on, when they tried to sort of restore some parts of the fort, the kind of excuse that was given was that it was, in any case, run down. There wasn't much to it, which is not really true. So with the physical remnants of the buildings, a lot of the records also were lost. So, so therefore, there are many details that we don't know, and we have to kind of logically interpolate from what we can find and put together, texts that we have with drawings that we have from different times, with maps that we have. All of them give you a kind of different picture of the fort. So there's no one source that we have for the fort, and all the sources, many times they contradict each other. So it's difficult to say with certainty what was there, but yes, it suffices to say that it was, it had a very large population, it had very complex functions, and it continued to be a cultural hub for the city of Shahjahanabad, with which it was very deeply linked, both physically and spatially. And again, that's something that doesn't exist today, and it's very, very hard to comprehend the relationship between the fort and the city. But it was actually at the center of the city, both in terms of patronage as well as in terms of its economic and daily life. So it's completely different, I think, from the way we imagine, life being lived then, because it's so different from our lives today. So we have to kind of leap and imagine and logically extrapolate, as I said.
So Meena has a question about, Meeta has a question about design. She likes to know if there was any significance of on the geometry of the arches, the number of scallops, etc. So something about that.
Well, you see, the thing is that I can tell you about the geometry of the proportions of the buildings and how they related to, and of course, as I mentioned, a lot of what we see as decoration, it has a link with structure as well as with symbolic kind of connections, both in terms of culture and religion. And each of the each of the remaining pavilions, I think palace pavilions in the fort, require actually a book to themselves. When I did a geometrical study of the fort, so one of the things that I found was that the open spaces, and again, you don't see the open spaces anymore, in the sense you don't know the boundaries of the open spaces anymore. The 1840s map that I showed, it's a very detailed map. It's one of the main sources of the fort, but it's not an exact rendition of the actual profile of the fort. We do have some photographs. For instance, Felice Beato, he when so there was this process of memorialization of the fort that happened after 1857, and Felice Beato was he was asked to document the sites the British wanted to remember. So one of the things that he actually photographed in the fort is a Nakar Khana forecourt. The Nakar Khana is the inner gateway of the fort, and the photograph is actually it documents an incident that happened in the forecourt where some Europeans were killed very tragically, but inadvertently it also shows you these colonnades, which are not there anymore. They were knocked down. And when I did a geometrical study of the colonnades, I found it's a dim photograph, so you don't have any details. But I did find that the proportions of these colonnades are linked to the proportions of the Nakar Khana. As far as the details of the fort are concerned, of the details of individual buildings, another thing to remember is if you throw your mind back to some of the images I showed you, you would have seen how they were bricked up, punched in, changed. For instance, the Mumtaz Mahal was used as a prison. Then it was used as a hospital. Then it was used as a sergeant's mess. The Diwan-e-Aam was used as a canteen. And the back of it was used as an ammunition depot. The Zafar Mahal was used as a swimming pool. There were privies that were made all over. And there were false ceilings that had to be, made later on. So what we see in the fort today is essentially the overall proportions of these buildings. Some of the decorative work that we see is actually part of the later restoration. There's been a lot of conjectural work that has happened both in the time of the British and as well as later on. So it's difficult to say how much of the decorative scheme is also part of the original presence of the fort. And but principally, as I mentioned, the decoration, I mean, we normally tend to look at decoration in isolation, but the thing is that the decoration is actually part of a structural system. So when you have scallops, or when you have squinches, or when you have the facets in the ceiling or in the wall or the arches, they also have a structural role to fulfill, which is in terms of making the structure stronger or reducing the weight of the masonry, etc. And but again, as I said, the fort's been hugely worked over, and but this is what remains. It requires detailed work, certainly, and there's scope for lots of people, I think, to come in, and I think we need much more study on the fort, right? So at various levels, not just at explaining the overall level, which is very important, but also at individual levels, which is what I'm saying, that each of the pavilions actually requires, I think, a book to itself. And it would be wonderful if that would happen, and one could do more detailed research and study on that. But as I said, records are very few, and a lot of it will have to be kind of worked out from what remains, keeping in mind the fact that what remains has been reworked, changed, all of that.
Thank you. And there's compliments galore for you in the chat. Lots of people saying that it was a lovely, knowledgeable talk, and that you're a walking and talking dictionary about the Lal Qila.
Well,
Sabira
that's
wants
very
to
nice
know.
of them, but what I want to say is that there's so much to the Red Fort. There's so much more to the Red Fort that needs to be done. But as I said, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do feel that this principle appreciation of the fact that there is very little that remains. So what remains has to be dealt with a lot of care and thought. I mean, we can't take liberties with it. Sorry. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. So, Sabira wants to know if you would like to drop in your Insta handle so people can follow you. If you could drop that in the chat.
I'm not on Insta. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook, but I'm not on Insta.
Okay. So that's really it. I think lots of compliments for you. Thank you so much. You enriched our Saturday evening with this information and the thought that we need to do something to preserve whatever we have remaining of the Red Fort for its richness and value to our heritage. On that note,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much. And I'd like to thank you, Suki, for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here and to be able to present the fort and have a dialogue. As a lot of the questions that were there, and some perhaps that haven't been asked, there's a lot of detail in the book. As I said, it's a very detailed book. It's got lots of drawings, and it explains the process of arriving at what I've part of what I've presented. It also explains a great deal about the conservation approach we need to have, because I think that's also vital. And I just want to end with this point that we tend to look at history as a compartment, as something from another time. My what I'd like to underline is that histories, of course, it's made at a certain time, but I think what's more important is that it's like a bank of knowledge, and it shows us how we can uh, how we can design intelligently even today, because a lot of the decisions that were taken in the design of the fort and the way it was lived in, I think are really, really applicable to today, because we all know we are in the middle of climate change. We all know we have to conserve resources, but none of us do that. And I think this is a very vital fact that the fort design shows us, that even if we have a lot of money, how do you live, how do you build in a way that you don't waste resources and yet you celebrate life. So thank you, and I hope all of us celebrate life, and we all do our bit for each other and for the planet. Thank you so much, Suki. Thank you, Amrita, and thank you everybody for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to our lovely audience who showed up and asked interesting questions. See you all again next Saturday. That's all for this evening.